Yesterday, the Supreme Court blocked a lower court order that would have forced Alabama to redraw a new congressional map. The ruling comes after Democrats sued to split one of Alabama's majority black districts into two so that Alabama would have two districts likely to elect a black member of Congress. While some critics are calling this a major blow to the Voting Rights Act, it's not all doom and gloom for Team Blue. The Economist reports that Democrats are actually doing quite well in the maps passed for congressional redistricting so far. Democratic strategist and owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp, and Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, join us now to discuss. Great to see you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Jennifer, we hear just so much fretting from Democrats about redistricting and how they're going to get killed and how Republicans are trying to rig the process, stack the deck, so on and so forth. Then at the end of the day, it looks like they're doing just fine.
Well, not just fine, just better than before. Republicans are still faring extremely well in this process, and this Supreme Court decision is a huge blow. In law school, you're taught a very, very, very simple concept. It's one of the most simple concepts that you learn when you're in law school. Racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, and political gerrymandering is constitutional, right? So Democrats have been screaming for years that we want to stop gerrymandering altogether, but Republicans refuse to work with us on it. So we're not expected to unilaterally disarm this process. We have to, unfortunately, engage in this gamemanship in order to try to win some additional seats. So yes, faring quote unquote well, but really what that means is just better than before.
Right. Rachel, that's a key point, right? The default, the baseline is 2010. When Republicans enacted like a massive gerrymander. So if it moves from a massive gerrymander to a slightly less massive gerrymander, that's still pretty favorable to Republicans, right? Can you break down what the consequences are of the Alabama ruling, like for each party and for the diversity of the Alabama delegation?
Yeah, a couple things to note about that ruling. And of course, Mark Joseph Stern, whose tweet you showed at the top, when he's not trying to get people fired for his tweets, he leaves out some key context, which is the fact that this is a stay. The full argument will be heard in the fall. So this isn't a decision on the merits. And you see at least Justice Kavanaugh and Alito try to make that point over and over again in their opinion. But at the end of the day, they relied on something called the Purcell principle, which is that you're not supposed to sort of upend election law right before an election is about to take place. And absentee voting in this particular election begins next month. So they said, look, we're not going to do this right now because we're going to rely on this principle. We will hear this case on the merits in the fall. So the decision hasn't been final. It hasn't been made. Now, of course, Democrats will point out, as Justice Kagan did, that this is an over-reliance on the court's shadow docket. They shouldn't be making these kind of decisions, without sort of a full hearing on the merits. So there is that back and forth. But I will say, for the state of Alabama, it's not as clear cut as I think some people want to make it out. It's not that districts are being shoved aside or removed. There is one district that is looking to be split into two. And that's the basis of this entire case. So to put this out there as outright voter suppression, that, the districts are being eliminated, that this is some, big racist plot, I don't think actually reflects the fact pattern on the ground. Now, at issue, right, is whether or not the vote should be more diluted, right, in the sense that, it's too concentrated in one district, it should be put into two. But that's what the Supreme Court will decide under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in the fall. So that is when the decision will be made. And to the second point about, whether or not there's a Republican wave in redistricting, I will say the doom and gloom we heard from Democrats at the top of this process hasn't played out, though, to the Economist's point. And part of it has been, I think, an actual intentional Republican strategy to say, instead of simply, expanding the map, we're going to focus on shoring up our red districts. And this idea that Democrats are somehow not in favor of this process, I think, is kind of baloney. You only have to look at the redistricting map in New York, which cuts the GOP delegation in half, thanks to the Democrat gerrymander there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's a political process anyway. I mean, I don't think I agree with the notion that no, we can. It's so easy to just do this fairly, and then no one will complain. Well, just independent-minded people will fairly, cut up the country so that there's competition. No one involved, everyone involved in this process is a political figure on one side or the other. And like both sides are doing this, and it's such an inherently political question how these districts will be drawn that I think it becomes hard to aspire for anything loftier. But you think I'm wrong about that,
Jennifer?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Me. Yeah. Oh, okay. No, I don't think you're wrong about that at this moment. I think absolutely Democrats are engaging in it, especially in New York. But throw a constitutional amendment in there to do away with political gerrymandering, I bet you're going to get all Democrats on board and no Republicans. We've been screaming about this for years. It's the same with campaign finance. We want to do away with the current rules and make it more stringent, except we cannot get cooperation from the other side. Therefore, we have to engage in it in order to win these elections, in order to make sure that we can enact other policy. It's unfortunately a necessary evil, but you want to go ahead and outlaw it altogether, sign me up. I'll advocate for it, and I'm sure you're going to get a bunch of Democratic Congresspeople on board.
Well, one quick thing about the interesting thing about the state of New York is that they did that, right? They said, no, we're going to take out partisan gerrymandering altogether. They gave it to a bipartisan commission. The bipartisan commission deadlocked. They couldn't do the job. And under the way the law was written, it went back to the legislature, which has supermajorities of Democrats in both chambers. So that's where we are. So I think to Ravi's point, like nobody wants to give up the political power here, which I suppose is understandable in some respects.
And just kind of constitutionally, progressives over the last 100+ years have always been more concerned about process. Like the progressive movement kind of came into being around the idea of process, anger at the corruption of the city machines and the way that they were stealing elections and doing patronage, and they were going to come in and they were going to clean up government. It was kind of the liberal elites of the time. That was their thing, and there's been that kind of goo-goo element of the left, ever since then. And I think to Jennifer's point, you're only seeing them say, you know what, fine, because they wound up in a place where a bunch of the blue states had these independent redistricting commissions and then a bunch of the red states did not. So this time they said, you know what, forget that independent redistricting commission, deadlock it and bring it back to the state legislature, and let's have a knife fight if it's going to be a knife fight. And so the goo-goo crowd is really in retreat at this point. But I do think, and I'm curious for your take on this, what would be a better way of doing it? I feel like proportional representation at the state level. In other words, if Ohio has 55% of the vote statewide is Republican, then they should have roughly 55% of the delegation. And that way you don't have to draw the lines anymore. It's just they get 7 and Democrats get 6 or whatever. I mean, what do you think, Rachel?
I mean, I think that sort of still dilutes the principle of just local representation at the end of the day, which is what a state district is. Obviously there's very partisan reasons people are drawn, or districts are drawn the way they are. Look at Jerry Nadler's redrawn district in New York 10. It's just completely tortured. And it's one of many, right, across the country. But the idea, at least sort of the romantic ideal behind that, is that subset of voters is supposed to receive specific, direct representation from their representative in the House, regardless of how the state is constituted. So whether or not we can get back to that, I don't know. But I think my concern with sort of the statewide, redistricting along sort of the statewide proportions is you dilute that element, which is sort of the point of the districts in the first place.
Well, according to correspondent for The Hill, Reed Wilson, House Democrats are on track for a net gain of seats from redistricting nationwide thanks to a series of state court victories in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Former President Trump let out a public sigh over Democrats' upper hand and said, quote, Republicans are getting absolutely creamed with their phony redistricting going on all over the country. We were expecting to do well in New York, and now we'll lose 4 seats because old broken down crow Mitch McConnell sits back and does nothing to help the party. Oh, Jennifer.
Let's fact check. Is he old broken?
Old broken crow. He's a turtle. He's not a.
Show me the lie, though. Show me the lie, okay? So it might be best Trump.
That is very, very
wrong species.
It's the wrong species.
No.
He's not.
That is extremely rude to crows. I don't appreciate it.
Let's not malign a great race of birds.
It's ageist towards old crows and ableist towards broken down crows.
I'm ageist and ableist, though. We don't care. We don't care about those. We haven't signed on to that yet.
Cancel this man. Yeah.
Okay, so assuming for a moment that I care at all what the former gentleman says, I think probably for the first time in history we're in agreement. I actually don't buy that Democrats are going to do that well going into the midterms. At least now we've got a bit of time before we get there. But yeah, we have fared a little bit better, as Ryan said, than we did in 2010. But I don't think that this is any cause to, ring bells and celebrate yet.
And Rachel, one of the hypocrisies about Trump that honestly gets me the most is that no one is allowed to criticize, in the Republican side, if you criticize him at all, you're a rhino, you're considered a never-Trumper, you're what. But he has no loyalty to anyone else. He can badmouth Mitch McConnell, 8,000 times per day, and no one says that he's being a bad Republican.
Well, I think Trump's filter is just he wants to win. He wants his party to win. And, if anyone he thinks that gets in the way of that, yeah, he trashes with impunity to some respect. And, I think it is interesting.
But he's just not in Georgia in 2020.
Right. He discourages voters from participating in the process until it's, quote, fixed.
Then he shouldn't have run in 2020 if he wanted to win.
Yeah.
What I think he is referring to is something, some concerns that Republicans have raised that the states haven't been aggressive enough in this process. I'm thinking specifically of Missouri and Indiana, where, again, Republicans chose not to take, really heavy Democrat districts and break them into two or move them around. Things they could have done to Emanuel Cleaver's seat, again, in Indiana, that they chose not to, again, because the strategy was to focus on shoring up already red seats, and not sort of wading into Dem districts. And that has sort of irritated or rubbed some people the wrong way. And I think that's what he's getting at. But, I'm not an expert here, so.
None of us can be.
None of us are.
What that man is thinking. All right, Jennifer, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And more Rising right after this.